Hello there. Here I am with Greg Bendian. Now, Greg Bendian is a drummer. Where are you based, Greg?
New Jersey, right
You
outside of New York City.
so I first came across Greg on the Sign of Four album, which I bought when it came out back in '97, which was an album maybe Pat Metheny. I think Derek Bailey's on there, and is it Paul Wurtigo? Um,
Yes.
a pretty avant-garde free album, not Pat's usual thing. So I've been aware of Greg for a long time, and he's done all sorts of things. He's probably for viewers of my channel, it's one of the interesting things is he runs the Mahavishnu Project. So, I followed Greg. And looking into his career, a lot of similarities with me. We're both drummers. We both love the Mahavishnu Orchestra. We both have a bit of a secret love of progressive rock as well, which is the same, and a love of free jazz. So, thanks for coming on the channel, Greg. It's lovely to see you. You know,
Thanks, Andy.
so
Nice to be here.
I think where should we start? I want to start with the free jazz thing. So, is it true I mean, looking into your career, you've played. I know you played with Derek Bailey. We've also played with Peter Bratzman. Is that correct?
Peter Brotzmann, Evan Parker, John Zorn, Roscoe Mitchell, Mark Dresser. I mean, in the '80s, when I came out of college, it was my goal to land on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and interface with the free improvisers that were there, and it was a very vital scene at that time. I got to play with Derek in I think as early as 1983.
Oh wow.
Yeah, he was living in New York at that time on the Lower East Side, and he was playing a concert at a little basement um, performance space called the Saint. I think it was on East Sixth Street, and it was Derek with George Lewis on trombone and Zorn on reeds. And I was already a fan of Derek. I'd been studying music improvisation company, and I had already heard Dart Drug with Derek and Jamie Muir duet. Had been following Derek for a few years. And I went up to him afterwards, told him I was a big fan, and said, I'd really like to play with you sometime. And he said, how's tomorrow? So it's one of those things where, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And Derek loved playing with percussionists. And, and we played together for many years after that. I worked with him in company in various cities. We did a duet record called Banter, and then of course the Sign of Four, which was pretty dramatic time in terms of Derek interfacing with Pat and Pat being a big fan of Derek's music, which I didn't expect. To backtrack a little bit on that, um, I've been playing duets with Paul Wurtico, and we have a duo album which is actually on Spotify called Bang. So Paul and I were friends, and I would go to see Metheny group shows. It was a sort of a end of an era for the Metheny group, and and became friendly with Pat. And Pat asked me what I was up to. I said, "Well, I have a new record with Derek Bailey. This is like '97, '96," and and he said, "Oh, I love Derek Bailey." I, you love Derek Bailey? Because I was very surprised to be frank. And he said, at one point in my life, I made it my business to hear every guitarist I could possibly hear. Not surprising for Pat Metheny there. So yeah, he knew well who Derek was, and he was keen on getting together and playing. So we did. We did shows, and we did studio, and I ended up producing the thing, choosing the tracks, naming the tracks, sequencing the tracks, and Pat was there along with me, but he kind of let me have free reign on that because I think he knew it was more my turf than his, and he was sort of dipping his toe into this free improvisation thing with Derek right away. So this was not like his previous avant so-called projects. Um, and then it was it was something that we thought would go on for a bit, but Derek was having health problems, and it didn't. So that record kind of stands as an infamous record. People either really really like it or they really really dislike it.
Oh, I love it. I think, and there's so much there to unpack. In terms of Derek Bailey, for me, here in the UK, he brought that book out on improvisation, and that was a big influence on me. When I went to art college, and I went to the library. They had that book, and I'm a big reader of all jazz history. And then he did a TV show. This is incredible to believe that Channel 4 commissioned a show on improvisation presented by Derek Bailey, one of the greatest free improvisers in history. And so I then picked up a few of his albums, 70s albums that he'd done with Anthony Braxton. Now, the reason I bring up the free stuff is because I want to really talk to you about fusion. And I want to talk to you about fusion in its pure form. And the fact that you've come up with from the free side, I explored that myself quite deeply, and I've played some free jazz, nowhere near what you've done. You've had you've played with the best, the cream. But I feel that when you study fusion, there's it's really interesting when you look at the influences from prog rock that were happening on free fusion, but also the influences that were coming from free jazz. And I think free jazz allowed a way of improvising that was really key. So when you look at John McLaughlin, he was actually spending time with Gunter Schuller, doing free jazz. So let's take you.
Stu Martin, Where Fortune Smiles, Carl Berger, Dave Holland. McLaughlin's in the free jazzy zone there for a minute in the UK. And of course, Lifetime was very free at times.
Yeah.
So, these are the crossroads of free open playing and jazz rock. So when you're looking at those guys that you mentioned and that I just mentioned, they're embodying that there's a way forward through these things. And if you're young enough to be open, as I was, and not know what the difference really was between one thing and if you're really parsing things, but no, Lifetime, you could tell when they were playing free. And Lifetime, you could tell that it was right on the edge of being a tune or not, and that they were listening. And the whole thing of listening became a very big part of this crossroads for me. My listening chops was something that I always worked on. I always worked on hearing what everyone was doing in any setting. And I think this is something that maybe musicians don't talk about enough, but listening to what's going on and deciding how your thing fits into it. And I heard that laid bare in free improvisation, because I heard Derek and Zorn and Jamie and Alex von Schlippenbach and Andrew Cyril and all these guys who were kind of bridging the gap between jazz, free jazz, and free improvisation. And I studied with Andrew in high school. I studied with Steve McCall in high school. And these were guys where I knew the sort of frame of mind of this new form of jazz was listening and responding and having a strategy for how you would approach freedom. See, this is the thing, again, I don't think a lot of free players talk about, but I always had a strategy. I always knew that I was going to limit myself to bowing a cymbal until I made something musical happen. I always knew I would limit myself to preparing the drum set with various metal objects, and that would be my vocabulary. And I kind of liked the limitations. And so I was approaching free jazz with the mindset of a composer, which was another, because I had studied composition from middle school into college and continued to compose to this day, chamber music and fully notated stuff. So I kind of wanted to always be at the nexus of all these different realities and figure out what do they have to do with each other. And for me, it was about not total freedom, but the freedom to actually limit your vocabulary to get to achieve a kind of clarity in the improvisation so that maybe the listener would have something to hang on to, but mainly so I would have something to hang on to, and you could hear me develop ideas. So when I did Interstellar Space Revisited with Nels Cline, and we were examining the Coltrane Rashid Ali duets from Interstellar Space, what was the vocabulary at play there? And what it was such a limited thing: drum set and tenor saxophone with a little bit of sleigh bell sprinkled in. That's it.
Mm.
So how can you make that interesting over 5 pieces of music, that make up Interstellar Space as a suite, the way we viewed it. And so in each piece, I limit how I'm going to approach the freedom, whether it's going to be, cymbal, metal sounds, whether it's going to be brushes, mallets, and then what can you do with each of those? So I've always been interested in extended techniques for percussion, and that was sort of a really good battleground for those to be tested out. And then I brought that into my solo percussion playing. But that idea of getting the most out of the least was always a big thing for me with free playing.
Yeah, I felt that there is a problem with the word improvisation, and then there's a problem with the word freedom, and there's the way I got into free jazz was actually, I was a big heavy metal fan. That took me to prog rock, that took me to fusion, and then I read about Bitches Brew. And Bitches Brew, I looked at all the players on it, and I think they're all my favorite players. I bought Bitches Brew, and it's not like a free jazz album, but me at 15 years old, I didn't understand it. Mm-hmm. And I had to put the headphones on and listen to it over and over again and try and work out what they were doing, which was me changing the strategies of my listening. Okay. And that took me down a certain route. Once I got it, and I can remember the moment I got it, was the track Spanish Key. I was leaping around my bedroom in victory that I was finally getting it, and the feelings that I was getting was new. It was a new thing, That took me towards Coltrane, and then it took me to Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, and I felt that part of what was happening with the early free jazz musicians, the freedom was actually relating to the civil rights movement as well. There was a political thing here.
Absolutely.
But out of that, you get players like Anthony Braxton. Which was much more to do with composition. It's a compositional way of playing. I've done a lot of free improvisation with a British bass player called Steve Lawson, and Steve Lawson is one of the great, British improvising bass players. Now, a lot of the stuff we did is tonal. It's quite melodic, but the fact is that all the music I did with Steve was entirely improvised. But Steve sees it as a compositional method. So there's so many ways to approach this. I can remember reading an interview with Chick Corea, and he said that with the circle band with Braxton, that they used to rehearse. Now, what did they rehearse? They rehearsed how the instruments would integrate together. What pitch do you tune the tom? And how would that integrate? So there's I suddenly realized it was like a nuclear reactor for new things to happen and exploration. Now, what's interesting for me with prog and fusion is the musicians grew out of that. I think if it had been the language of bebop, fusion couldn't have happened. You couldn't have integrated that in. The part of the freedom is that the musicians were free. That bands like the Grateful Dead and Hendrix were free in a way. And so there's this big melting pot from which fusion came out of.
Hendrix is important, though. It's good that you touch on Hendrix, because Hendrix is big for Miles. Hendrix is big for everyone, because for me, when people use the term fusion, he's a prime example of a fusion artist. He has the blues, he has R&B, he has jazz, he has rock and roll, he has, what am I leaving out? Sonic exploration. So there's so much there to inspire one. And of course, he inspired Miles and a generation of jazz musicians. So what is Hendrix but a catalyst, for so much change, revolution? And Miles, he changes his music because of Hendrix.
What's interesting about Hendrix is if he'd have stood up at Woodstock with a bassoon and done that Star Spangled Banner, that would have been pure free jazz. But the fusion is the fact that he was able to take that sort of thing and present it in a way which changed the world. And of course, where was he getting that from? Of course, he was getting that from Coltrane and a whole bunch of people. And so I found this when I was a youngster, that I thought that there was an answer to stuff in free jazz. I really studied it. I was really interested in it, and I've played it a little bit. And I think it's something that doesn't get mentioned in the whole history. It's also there with prog rock, with bands like Soft Machine and all that. That's a really interesting thing. What I'm interested in with you is how you got to it. So can you back up and say sort of, what's the order of your development to musician? Because you're much more highly trained, I think, than me. I was a rocker that slowly moved. What was your background to get to this stuff? That you end up playing with Derek Bailey. It's incredible.
Well, it's. I'll try to condense it, but basically, as a 10-year-old in '73, we had Birds of Fire on 8-track tape.
You lucky thing.
But I was lucky because my Uncle Dave was sort of an older brother figure to me, and he was living that stuff in his college years. So he turned me on to Genesis. He turned me on to Mahavishnu, Return to Forever, Where Have I Known You Before? I remember that hit hard. So I was aware of prog and jazz rock simultaneously. And I noticed that guys like Chick and John were classical minded players, that they had, they knew Ravel and they knew Stravinsky, and they named their album Birds of Fire. And they would do these references to Miles Davis, Miles Beyond, or Love Supreme on Love, Devotion, Surrender. And all of a sudden, I'm being exposed to jazz when I didn't realize it. I had heard jazz through my dad, who was a big listener to Errol Garner and Ahmad Jamal and Kenton and Basie and all of that stuff. So I was lucky in that my dad was a jazz fan. So I kind of had it in the back of my mind, but when I went back and willingly sort of did it of my own avail, that's when I started hearing more adventurous kinds of jazz. The connection into free improvisation, which really was, I have to say, kind of the British school as much as it was the New York school, was I was listening to King Crimson's Lark's Tongues and Aspic. And as many of your listeners will know, Jamie Muir is the percussionist in King Crimson on that album. Now, Jamie Muir was not the first free improviser to be in King Crimson, because Keith Tippett was on the band before that.
Yeah.
And he came from Derek's circle. So I've always wanted to ask Robert Fripp, to what degree were you checking out Derek's circle of players? And, would he have interesting things to say about Derek? Because Derek was a really important figure on that scene, but also just the whole aspect of I play from zero. I come in and I play whatever I want to play. I don't have a preset idea. It's very spontaneous. So I went from Lark's Tongues and Aspic to 1970, back 2 years. That's really interesting to think, it was only 2 years, to ECM Music Improvisation Company. And that's Derek Hugh Davies, who was one of Stockhausen's assistants on electronics, Christine Jeffrey on voice, Evan Parker, Jamie, and Derek. And that changed everything, because I didn't know that you could, at that time, that what they were doing, making music from noises, from squeaks and scrapes and kerblanks. And that was a total change in language for me, because I couldn't tell who was playing what. I couldn't tell what the instruments were. I couldn't tell anything. It sounded so organic. And from that moment, I searched out Derek's music. So it really was an incredible crossover between King Crimson and the music improvisation world. I don't know how many other people responded that route, but that was the route for me. I heard Jamie. I said, "What the hell is he playing? It's just I can't identify any of these instruments." And that's when I started discovering found objects for percussion that existed already in the John Cage stuff. The contemporary percussion language included things like cans and bottles and tuned glasses and all these different things. So I kind of, at that time, I was studying classical percussion with Gary Van Dyke from the New Jersey Percussion Ensemble. And I was very interested in that world. So I saw sort of and then you have guys like Cornelius Cardew that, or Gavin Bryars that were connecting the free improvisation world with the composition world. And I was lucky enough to have good teachers at that time, and also a good record shop being right outside of New York City. You could go to see these guys. There was a place called Soundscape on 52nd Street. It was run by a wonderful woman, Verna Gillis. And she had Sun Ra, she had Brotzman, and she had Donald Eiler. And I went to everything there. Ornette's guys all played there. Ed Blackwell was there all the time. Jack DeJohnette at the Public Theater and all Special Edition and New Directions. And Jack was a huge inspiration because he would do anything. It could be free or it could be just straight ahead. It was funk, whatever. So that was kind of where it was, Andy. It was kind of looking back, looking at the present moment, looking forward, and kind of seeing that these things were related. If you could have a free improvising percussionist in a rock band, so what can't you do? Can you have a classically trained percussionist in Cecil Taylor's unit? Apparently, because Cecil heard what I was doing, liked it, and then we talked about Elliott Carter and Stravinsky and Bartók and his classical interests. And I was able to pick up on that in his music and use it to the advantage of the music, which was, I know what that is, but previously he had free jazz drummers. So I was kind of like one foot in the free jazz, one foot in contemporary classical, and Cecil liked that. He was cool with it. He never told me what to play. And then when we did Inflorescence for A&M in 90, I was able to do 2 percussion solo pieces, and he included them on the album. It was kind of that intersection of free jazz and contemporary composition, where I agree with your friend Steve, that it's sort of instant composition, and that term has been used in the Brit School, instant composition, and the idea that you have like guys like AMM and the Eddie Prevost and John Tilbury and these guys, Keith Rowe, who were one foot in the classical contemporary world, one foot in the free improvisation world to this day. So that having the classical thing did come in handy and has come in handy because I find that stuff fascinating. I find Debussy fascinating. I find Ravel and Stravinsky and Bartók and all those guys fascinating. And I wonder, sometimes when you listen to it on the surface, doesn't it sound completely free? Some of that Carter stuff, yeah, it's really dense, or as Zappa would say, statistically dense. And, there's a lot going on. And so that makes it as challenging a listen as it does to listen to the, Global Unity Orchestra playing free improvisation. And I was always interested, like, what are the differences? How do you go about making that sound? How do you go about making that sound? How do you go about approaching a group? And I did examine it in terms of how long I would analyze free improvisations, how long an event took to develop, and then you have what was the transition, and then how do you get to something else? So I really thought about that. I thought about rhythm in terms of free improvisation. I always felt a pulse. I never felt completely untethered from a pulse in free improvisation. So I feel like I was able to do all that I wanted in that setting. New York guys tend to be more not looking for regular rhythm in free improvisation, whereas the LA guys that I fell in with as well, they were more cool with different types of rhythms, more grooves stuff, like what stuff that I did with bone structure. So, I kind of always am looking to see who's doing what.
Mm.
how they're, what percentage of this are they using, what percentage of that are they using. Uh, and there are young guys now that are combining all of the things we're talking about. Brad Meldau has a new album with material by Gentle Giant that he's putting through the machinery of his brain. So I like that kind of thing very much. I like not being pinned down, but sort of pointing to different connections between things.
I think this is the true spirit of fusion, isn't it? This is what we're really talking about. That there's that feeling of there being no frontiers. I've always been a big student of jazz history. I think this is why I'm enjoying doing my channel, and I'm going to get onto your channel at some point, because my other favorite channel in terms of prog and fusion is yours. This is why, I knew you from sort of the free jazz thing, and then when I saw you talking about Gentle Giant, I thought, oh my God, this guy's like, he's open to absolutely everything. And then the fact that that's what drew you to free jazz is really interesting to me. But the thing is interesting with jazz, if you go right back, and we can't go really any further back than the original Dixieland Jazz Band, that's because before then it's a mystery, and I find this fascinating. Jazz is a mystery. We don't really know we don't know what Buddy Bolden sounded like. We don't know what was going on before. As soon as they recorded it, it affected it, a bit like quantum. The observer affected it. But when you go back to Livery Stable Blues, it's about sounds and noise. And then when Louis comes in, Louis is the genius of organizing that. So Louis could play very beautifully. He could sound like a sort of fanfare, but he integrates noise so incredibly. He go, in his voice as well. And I think people, they don't understand that that's one of the big gifts of jazz is the integration of just pure noise and sound into music. And I wonder how much that affected classical music, or contemporary classical music, in that if you think what's happened in 1917, you've got Rites of Spring and that sort of thing, but the integration of just pure noise, I think, is something that's come from jazz. And I think the 60s free jazz musicians, actually, when you especially someone like Albert Ayler, I listen to him and it's like he's in the future, but he's also right back. He's gone back beyond that point to that mysterious point in history where this music that we don't really understand comes from. And it was funny talking with Narada, because I had a bit of a revelation in that interview when he talks about John McLaughlin studying black holes, and how music really, the awe that I feel with music, because I think he's coming face to face with the infinite. It's something that we actually want to avoid, in regular life. What's beyond death, what's the limits of the universe, how's it, all that sort of stuff is sort of embodied in, I think, the music I really love. And I think you've got to be brave to go there. But I really heard that, especially in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, when I first heard Birds of Fire, there was a sense of awe in that music. There's a sound world, Did you feel the same? Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, because I always thought Sanctuary was like an environmental piece. Like you step into Sanctuary and you don't want to leave.
Yeah.
I would go to sleep with it playing on a cassette player next to my pillow. So yeah, the idea that also Birds of Fire indicates this is a separate world. Birds of Fire, Miles Beyond, separate language. Celestial Terrestrial Commuters, separate language. Thousand Island Park, chamber music. And just goes on and on like that. And then there's full out blowing and trading and almost the Dixieland thing, of course, when they're playing together. So yeah, it's
followed up with Open Country Joy, which is another place, which is this sort of Americana. I mean, there's Americana I could hear in the, and I think that's why Jerry Goodman was so important, because he sort of brought in a classical thing. He could be a very, very fine classical musician if you studies, but he's also got this sort of Americana thing going in. This is what I find really exciting about music. It's lovely to talk to someone who's, like you, because you really are right at the limits, that you can go from prog to free jazz and see that all the links between that. Can we chat a little bit about the Mahavishnu Project and how that came about? Because I thought with Greg, I thought, will he get insulted if I say this to him? But he has played some of the most high art music, but he's also got one of the great tribute bands. And I've played in many a tribute band as well, but mostly.
Now I have to protest,
I
sir,
thought you might.
because I do not think it's a tribute band. It's a repertory ensemble.
Oh, I love it.
And so the idea of what is jazz repertoire, that was something that Nels Klein and I came up against when we saw the Ken Burns documentary on jazz, and it didn't include so much. And we thought, well, how does one then position what you feel is important in history and what is repertoire to you? Well, we thought free jazz was repertoire. And then in '98, Interzone, my group with Nels Klein, Alex Klein, and Stuart Liebig, were doing a record called Myriad, and I wanted to do Sanctuary. I thought, why wouldn't we do Sanctuary? Nels is going to play something amazing on it. It's going to be incredible. We did an improvised introduction to it before we got to the pedaled E, and that was the moment where I kind of I was looking at Coltrane and Mahavishnu as being repertoire. And why didn't people play later Coltrane? And at that time, I mean, in the '90s, honestly, no one cared about Electric Miles. So in the '90s, we were kind of looking at even the first Interzone record, which I dedicated to Gentle Giant, because they inspired me to have tuned percussion in rock music. And they had counterpoint, and they had real virtuosity in the music. The keyboard player, Kerry Minier, was a classically trained Royal Conservatory composer, percussionist, keyboardist. So many things that were pointing to, well, repertoire is still repertoire. Now, at that time, and it's less so now, but at that time, you need about 30 years away from something for it to be viewed, legitimately as repertoire. And I was looking at Mahavishnu, and it was about 20 years from 71 to 2001 when I started the Mahavishnu Project as a project that would play that music, but in our way. So we weren't looking to reproduce solos. We weren't looking to reproduce even arrangements. At times I would mess with the arrangements, but in a way that would give us more freedom to be ourselves and to take it from the original guys to maybe a different place, a more personal place, but still respectful of that vocabulary. Because if you're going to play Cobham, you have to have your rudimental thing together. You have to have, your independence together. You have to be able to conceptualize groupings of twos and threes and threes and twos. And if you can become comfortable in that language, then you can achieve some sort of freedom. So I used every album, less so for Apocalypse, but I did an arrangement for string quartet and soprano of Smile the Beyond. We never really got into stuff on Inner Worlds, but everything else was on the table. We did complete Emerald Beyond as a suite of pieces. We did complete Intermounting Flame, complete Birds of Fire, Lost Trident sessions, anything. And then we did music of John McLaughlin before Mahavishnu, music of John McLaughlin after Mahavishnu. We've branched out into Jan Hammer's music. So it kind of became a repertoire project of all jazz rock that we could get our hands on, or that was possible with the group, with that instrumentation. So a tribute, yes, but a living tribute, I think. A live wire kind of tribute where something's going to jump off, and that's the way it should be. It should be spontaneous, and there should be a lot of listening and a lot of responding going on, and understanding the spirit of jazz rock. I mean, when people use the term fusion, just to put a finer point on it, I just view fusion as a concept, not as a genre. I think it sort of became a lazy term to say something is fusion. Well, fusion of what? Fusion cuisine right now is Spanish and Chinese and, Cuban and Swedish. So the idea of fusion is alive and well, always has been. Stravinsky and Bartok were fusion musicians.
Yeah, I on my channel I tried to make the distinction that I in the early days I called it jazz rock, and that's what it was, and the rock that they were, it was. Jazz is always, I mean, rock music is jazz. I mean, it's come out of jazz. It's a very specific thing of jazz mixing with the very exciting progressive styles that were coming out at the end of the 60s. And so, yeah, I see that distinction. When I came up, I started playing drums in 1980. My dad was a big jazz fan, so I'd listen to like Chico Hamilton and Brubeck, Melbourne Jazz Quartet, and then obviously Count Basie, Duke Ellington, all that sort of stuff. So I knew my jazz when I started playing rock music, and it was always there. The guy that really drew me towards jazz was Wynton Marsalis, because Wynton Marsalis was emerging at the same time. But Wynton came with a certain conservatism that was creeping in to jazz as I was coming up. And it took me a while. I went through a proper jazz snob stage where I actually sold my Judas Priest albums and AC/DC albums. I regretted this, later on. But I sold those albums, and then I had to work it out that no, the Wynton Marsalis, Ken Burns view of jazz was completely wrong. So my next question is, how much is the Mahavishnu Project a statement against that? Is that something that you're aware of, that you're up against it with this style of music? I mean, I feel that John McLaughlin is the greatest British jazz musician, but you walk around the country here and ask, I go to our jazz world in Britain and say, who's the greatest British jazz musician? They won't say John McLaughlin. So I felt that I started to think there's a prejudice against this. And so I really see what you're coming from, because to me, it seems a statement against other sort of conservative influences that have now been in jazz for quite a time. How do you feel about that? I call it the jazz snobbery, and
we in New York we call it the jazz police.
The jazz police, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was offensive, quite frankly. To wait for that moment where the big, public television series is going to be the history of jazz, and not have the entire history of jazz and be exclusionary of things. I just thought that was offensive, because I knew better.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you didn't sell me that Satchmo was the only thing that happened in the last 100 years or so. So I was already, way past that curve onto another curve, waiting for someone to deliver a true history of jazz, and leaves out anything that has electric instruments and, has any sort of non-harmonic content. So that was offensive. And yes, it was a response. The Coltrane project was with Nels was a response. Even the musical box for me was a response, because, playing the music of your life besides my original music, repertoire is a statement. You play the music you love. You play the music that you feel you can contribute to. And I always felt Mahavishnu was underserved. I felt that early Genesis was underserved. I felt that Coltrane later works were underserved. I felt that Monk was underserved. So, Thelonious Monk, I had a band called Evidence with Mark Rebo on guitar, and we were exploring Dolphy and Monk tunes. So the tunes that weren't getting played were the ones that I thought, well, we should play them. Somebody should play them. Why not us? And then I realized, in order to have a Mahavishnu group, you couldn't just have a pickup group. You had to have an ensemble that really specialized in that stuff. You had to have the right keyboardist. You had to have the right violinist. You had to have the right guitarist. And to be able to play that music and do it justice. I never claimed that we were doing it better. We were doing it kind of differently, and we were trying to do it our own way. And so that, I felt, was the spirit of all jazz. I know Jan Hammer wouldn't agree with me that Mahavishnu is a form of jazz, but for me it is. And the modalism, even the fact that they were sticking to, a single mode for a composition, that harkened back to Coltrane. And of course, John would admit that openly. So we always we were taught by the best that you look backward while you're looking forward. And that's sort of been my mantra. 1 foot in the present, 1 foot in the future, and your third foot, or reaching back with your
Yeah.
arm into the past, right? And what did we learn, and what can we do, and how do we celebrate it, and how do we make it fun and make it relevant 50 years later? That was the question of all of this stuff. Is when you try to rewrite history or exclude vast movements or revolutionary movements from history, that's politically very, shaky ground. It's sociologically shaky ground when you're leaving out who the people were that branched off and made a significant. I mean, there's a big run from the early 60s into the 70s of that music, freer kinds of music existing in classical, jazz, and rock. How can you deny it? So yes, it was a statement to answer your question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally get where you're coming from, and it's interesting because if you take a jazz critic like Stanley Crouch, some of the stuff,
Take them.
yeah, some of the stuff really profound he said about that, like jazz is like sort of a liberal democracy. It's that the jazz is an incredible form because, and it's not like, say, Indian classical music that's improvised, because you're still in a very, you cannot go in and play the blues in an Indian classical, and you can't play modern classical in an Indian classical ensemble. But in a jazz group, you can. Is that you're finding a way to be yourself totally within this world that you've entered. It's the American dream, if you like. And then he then denies everything that's come from that from about 1962 onwards. And I think it comes from something that I've really struggled with, because I'm a pretty technical drummer. I've studied, I learned all the Mahavishnu stuff when I was a kid. I would sit and playing 13, 16 for 2 hours, and all that type of stuff. That was my training ground. And I love Charlie Parker. I play the guitar as well. And I would struggle trying to play like Charlie Parker because it's really, really hard. And then I discovered Ornette Coleman. And Ornette Coleman for me was, I didn't get it. I didn't get it. And I studied it. And then I suddenly thought, oh my God, he's provided an answer here for me to get into this. That has the language of bebop in it, but also allows me to get in from where I'm coming from, which is a rock guy trying to go back to this music. And it was like, again, democratizing the music. I think this is something that jazz has a real difficulty. It wants to sort of put up. It doesn't want to let anybody in. It wants to say this is really difficult, and you've got to earn your dues, And reading interviews with the fusion guys, is that Stephen Kindler, who obviously played, he was going to John LaPonte, and John LaPonte was going, well, you need to learn your dues, and then Jan Hammer was going, just forget all that and just play, and that I can see both of those sides, but I think it does worry me that jazz will in the end die if you don't have a system that allows new musicians to come in and play it.
Well, let me tell you from the first person perspective. I worked with Ornette briefly in 2000, and he had a chamber ensemble called the Harmonic Chamber Players. And we were performing and recording his piece La Statue, which was a tribute to the Statue of Liberty. And it was a chamber group of people, mainly Juilliard string players, and me on timpani and Lou Soloff on trumpet. And we were really the only kind of improvisers in the group. So I get to the first rehearsal, and I get the sheet music is on my stand in front of 3 timpani. I'm at Harmonic Studios in Harlem, which was Ornette's rehearsal and recording space. And I'm looking at the part, and I swear, Andy, it's literally dun 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 dun. And I'm looking at it and going, how is this? What is this? How is this going to work in a harmonic situation? Ornette comes over to me How you doing? Hi, Ornette. It's great to be here. And he looks at the timpani part and he looks at me and he says, I don't want you to do any of that. I want you to do your thing. Now, that was an incredible moment. And it also, he handed it to me. He said, look, I know you can improvise. I know you can come up with something better than I came up with on timpani, but I'm going to, of course, as a fellow composer, he's entrusting me with doing the tasteful musical thing that needs to be done in that situation. So I'm listening to his vocabulary, writing for the strings, writing for the bass. And I thought, Ornette, he had two bass players very, very frequently. So what if I was a second bass player playing a bass percussion instrument, the timpani? So at that point, I started playing more like Charlie Hayden and doing intervallic things and tuning with my feet while I was playing and to get different kinds of chordal things going. And I had a ball. And Ornette loved it. And it's on a recording somewhere that hopefully will be released someday. But that's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about, where Ornette knew he was writing a chamber piece, but he wanted an improvised timpani part. So what are you going to do about it? And I had to come up with something that I thought would work. And this was the guy, this is Ornette. Gave me the same amount of freedom that Cecil did, that Derek did. But they trust you to come up with something that's cool. They trust you to come up with something musical.
I've got bubbling excitement in my stomach at this because I think this is what I'm searching for. I've only, this is the second interview I've done on this. The first one was with Nada, second one is with you. I've got no questions. We're totally making this up as we go. As we're talking, I'm thinking, if this video, I can just get across to some of the guys who watch my channel and are into fusion, into prog, and are seeing Ornette and Coltrane as being difficult, so this is a difficult thing. This is the little thing that's now coming out of this, and I'm learning this from you, because for me, it wasn't like that. For me, it was very exciting because it was actually anyone can get into this, and I felt there was two camps within free jazz. There was Coltrane, who wanted to be free. So Coltrane's writing giant steps, and he's going, perhaps if I can play in three keys at the same time, I can break harmony. And I used to put on Interstellar Space and listen. And I remember thinking one day, I thought, oh my God, he's playing giant steps. He's playing giant steps, but this is the back end of giant steps. When he did giant steps, he was trying to break it out. He's now broken it out, and he's basically in all keys at once. It's Interstellar Space. He's in all keys at once. But Coltrane had to, like, as though he's moving a boulder of jazz history. He's pushing this boulder through, and every time he gets there, Ornette's there like a jester, dancing around, going, yeah, and you can just do it like this if you want. And those two things are the bedrocks of free playing. And there was an excitement I got from Ornette, which was, yeah, the tune's there, and you're playing it, but the reason why you're having problems with that, Charlie Parker, is because you want to go somewhere else. Where do you want to go?
And Ornette is a huge Charlie Parker guy.
Oh, you can hear it.
Jimmy Lyons with Cecil, that man on alto, a Charlie Parker guy. Eric Dolphy, a Charlie Parker guy. So you had the notion that there was a continuation of the guys you love. I mean, I would think that on if you listen to my playing on Inflorescence, you'll hear some Paul Motion in there, because he's one of my main guys, and he was a guy who's playing with with Arlo Guthrie at Woodstock, and then he's playing with Keith Jarrett, and he has his own groups, and he plays in a way that's free, but you feel time. And I read about him talking about how he played, and he said he always thinks of time, even when it's free. And I was in high school and influenced by all these guys. I was reading Downbeat magazine religiously, Derek's improvisation book, anything I could get my hands on to learn, including going to the masters like Andrew and Steve McCall and saying to them, how do you do this? What is this? Going up to Blackwell and saying, so you're thinking pulse, but you're not thinking meter. And he said, yeah, that's right. So being lucky enough to be around those guys, to ask them questions, to listen in person, to be able to then play with them, it kind of confirmed a lot of things. Like they were the most open-minded musicians I'd ever met. And I liked that. That meant that I had the freedom and the carte blanche to do what I wanted. You know, I will point out to your listeners that the title track of Inner Worlds, that's crazy stuff. It's totally like free. Well, there's a note generator that's going on playing a set of pitches. Nard is playing his ass off, and John is wailing on top of it like Coltrane. So it's still in there. You know, it's still there on Inner Worlds, which then also has devotional ballads on it. So, you know, this is my damage. There's no way that I could have gone unaffected from this because I saw all of my heroes doing whatever they wanted. Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Whatever we really want to do. And I was lucky to grow up in this area where it was available to me. I could go see the Cats play. I could go to a record shop, Sound City in Teaneck, New Jersey, and they had imports. They had imports, Andy. We could get bootlegs. We could get imports of like the first Gentle Giant records. They were all imports.
Yeah, I know. I was in the same boat. Sorry about this. Hang on. Sorry about that. And I'll all this in as well. It's my wife was just shouting me for my dinner. She's cooked my dinner for me. That's what it is.
You better appreciate it.
Yeah, I know. So
So that spirit. What I'm saying is that spirit from Lifetime. It shows up, 6 years later on Inner Worlds, where it's sonic exploration and playing. But then at the end, there's a chord sequence by Stu Goldberg, and it brings it all together to a triumphant end. So it was kind of these, order from chaos thing, which is another big concern of mine is order and chaos. What percentage of what is happening in your art at any given time? Because spontaneity introduces the possibility of chaos, and chaos can yield interesting things.
Well, this is what I was about to ask you next, because my journey through this was once I'd had that revelation with Bitches Brew, it was a Love Supreme, and then I got into Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, and it was a lot of that sort of American prop, full-on classic free jazz that I listened to. Then I discovered, the European guys, but I ended up going from seeing it as being very difficult to music that I was like, so what is the limit? Where is this limit and where can I go? And I found it one day, and it was the album Machine Gun by Peter Broadsmith. And when I got that, and on my channel, I keep thinking, I really want to do a video about Machine Gun, because that was where I went, right, this is it now. I've got there. So
someone who took Ayler very seriously.
Really?
So that was my experience with Broadsman. Was we had a trio with William Parker. We did an album called Sacred Scrape, and we toured. It was a regular group for a few years, and I felt like I was a bridge between his complete screeching, screaming, primal scream sound with Ayler, and William Parker and I coming from Cecil's band and having a rhythmic thing that would go with it. So I'm kind of always aware of what the different roles are of the musicians in a group, and if William Parker is a next generation bass player who's playing with Mingus's bow, by the way, so he's got a clear conscious connection to the history of the music. But we all believed that this was where jazz was going, was into freedom with constraint or organization that you impel upon it. And that's how it moves forward, and that's how it becomes personal to you. Is what are my tastes and my preferences in a jazz situation? Democracy of voices. I think that's really important. I think that's one thing you learn from Satchmo that's still existed in jazz rock is equality of voices. Okay, maybe not the bass player, but often the bass player, because then you have guys like Stanley and Jocko who really brought the electric bass more into a forward role in jazz rock. But that democracy, I think, also influenced Elliott Carter in classical music, who said as much. Jazz influenced the third string quartet and the independence of the voices. So there are guys who were coming from the other side that were looking at jazz, and jazz was infecting how they thought about it because of that thing of, well, you're not just the drummer now, you're a voice in the ensemble. What are you going to do about it? And that's Billy, that's Narda, that's Max, that's Tony, that's Jack. That's all our favorite guys. John Bonham is a voice in that ensemble, right? So that idea that also you touched on the transition into jazz rock from jazz and rock from jazz is that there weren't rock drummers. Ginger Baker wasn't a rock drummer. He was a jazz drummer playing rock music. So if that doesn't clinch it for you, I don't know what to do. I mean, Mitch Mitchell, swinging on Third Stone from the Sun.
Well, there's a certain point where all drummers are jazz drummers. If you're in a country band in the late 1930s and you get a drummer in, there's no country drummers, it's a jazz drummer. And if you're in a blues band and you get a rhythm section in, that's a jazz drummer. And that goes on and on and on. That actually stays right up until the 1960s, where I think people like Bonham, and I don't know if you know, I played for Robert Plant for
I do know that.
Yeah, so I actually I had one of Bonham's kits to play for about a few months, which is another story that we might say for another time. But and so I got Robert and a couple of my other friends played with John Bonham. And although John Bonham is like sort of the first generation of actual rock drummers, but it's still come from jazz, So this is the thing, that you take the jazz out of all music, and there's no music left, in terms of popular music, rock music, and all this type of thing. Once I realized I've become a bit of a jazz snob, and I started to listen to all sorts of things. I can remember I got into Red Hot Chili Peppers, I got into like Anthrax and Slayer and Napalm Death. My drum tech was the tech for Napalm Death, so I've got connections with that band. And through Napalm Death, I then discovered John Zorn, A Naked City with Mr. Bungle, all that type of thing that was going on. And I suddenly found myself going back towards the free jazz, and I was listening to Last Exit. I'm a huge Bill Laswell fan, and I feel he doesn't get the credit he deserves as a fusion musician, one of the greatest fusion musicians. But again, he was then putting groups together, which would be him, Tony Williams, and Derek Bailey. I think that album is incredible because you get to hear them with Bill Laswell production. It's an incredible thing, So in the late 80s, again, for me, that all opened up, and that's how I got to Machine Gun. It was almost like a sort of thrash metal. I was interested in that as an idea, and I could see the relationship between free jazz and metal. I think, and I'd love to sit down with the Napalm Death guys and find out whether they were listening to Broadsman and stuff like that, but that you get pockets in history, don't you, where music seems to all come together, and it's like a nuclear reactor, and then it just spews out all these new forms of music, And so, yeah, I'm saying this because I think if anyone's watching this and they're a bit afraid of this music and they see it as being difficult, then I'm hoping from our conversation they may be able to go and listen to it with new ears and realize, well, no, this is because you're putting the rules on it. You expect it to be something, but actually it's going, well, no, it doesn't have to be like this. It could be something else, I was very another album that really influenced me was Trio Music by Chick Corea, and they do monk tracks on the one disc, and then on the other disc they do sort of really improvised music, but completely different to Broadsman because they're playing in a really balanced, and it sounds almost like modern classical music. So the term free jazz is actually trying to cover all sorts of different things, isn't it? And that's the beauty of it, is exploring those areas. So yeah, I hope a few people will, dare to go and pick up a copy of Free Jazz by Ornette, or what would be the albums to get, I think, for a fusion or prog fan going towards that? What would you suggest?
Well, you bring up a good point, which is that there's a definite visceral quality to the more guitar-based free jazz thing. So people might like Body Meta by Ornette Coleman, which has two guitars, Bern Nix and Charlie Ellerby, and Jamaldine Tacuma on electric bass. Shannon Jackson, who you mentioned from Last Exit, on drums. Ornette going electric. That primetime band. Those are all really fun bands. But I don't know. The ones that cross over into electric territory, that was sort of not as interesting to me as the ones that were making acoustic instruments sound electronic. And so guys like Eiler, who had that kind of overblowing and really just force of sound, bass players playing with the bow, and getting all sorts of harmonics and partials out of the strings. Barry Guy is a great example, great British bass player from classical all the way back to early music, playing free improvisation with Derek and Evan. So, I think an important record for Derek Bailey or for Cecil Taylor is also go to the solo records. Chick Corea's solo piano improvisations.
Without a doubt. Brilliant, yeah.
That's how I learned to play with Cecil, is I played along to his solo piano recordings. That's a way you can learn how things develop if you're listening, how rhythm is happening in that music, and you play along. It's like music minus you. And you get somebody, solo Braxton record.
Yeah.
You could play along to that. And so I guess I picked up on that from Music Minus One, the Jamie Aebersold records, is, there's no drums on that Charlie Hayden duets record. I could play with Charlie Hayden and Keith Jarrett because there's no drummer on the record. So there are ways of approaching these things that make it more approachable and more dealable. And I think that bringing it down to duets and trios taught me a lot. Being able to hear two things that are going on in the music, three things that are going on in the music. Again, Interstellar Space is a good record for that because it's just drums and saxophone, Coltrane and Rashid Ali. I think that would be sort of my tip of how to get on the inside of this music. When there's 4 and 5 and 6 and more people playing, improvising together spontaneously, it does become a bit of a soup, a bit of a stew. And I think that makes it unapproachable for some people. But I when I was in Brazil with Cecil in 1989, that summer, I was bringing cassettes of solo Derek records and giving them to people because they'd never heard the stuff. And I thought, well, the best way for them to get in on it's like, just listen to this guy, what he's doing with the guitar. You've never heard anybody approach the guitar this way. He's approaching it like it's a percussion instrument. He's approaching it like it's a keyboard. I mean, he's not approaching it like it's a guitar event. It's not a guitar, get your rocks off situation. So, yeah, I feel like the solo, and then that's why I developed solo too, because you have to, Muhal Richard Abrams would say, you have to be able to play solo. You have to be able to present your ideas by yourself, and then you can put them into other people's music. And that was something that stuck with me pretty early too, studying with Steve McCall, who was in the AACM and was in AIR with Henry Threadgill and Fred Hopkins, is they could play solo. They could play a solo concert and it would be interesting. And they would think about, how do you play 5 different pieces and keep people's attention? So I learned early on that you have to be able to still make sense somehow, that it's not just that's only so interesting for so long. And then it's either about rhythm or atmosphere or tone or articulation or how people are receiving the music, how you are trying to express. Are you trying to express rage? I mean, that there's a limited amount of time that people can hang with that, you know. Or are you presenting, like I was spoiled by these early bands we've all been talking about for the last while, that it was a variety. If you look at the Zeppelin stuff, it's a variety of approaches. It's blues based, but it's taking it further and it's trying to not be, in the words of Lester Young, a repeat offender. Trying to come up with different aspects of your musical personality. So I would just say, be open to the fact that it's not going to be the same thing all the time, that it will change. The music develops in its own way very organically, I think, when people are listening to each other. Because, oh, he did that, so maybe I should do this. And then people can hear that happen in real time. And then all of a sudden the listener is drawn in because they heard you respond to someone going, da 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 da, and then you can play ba ba bi ba. And or you can just lay down a foundation for them and they can play over it. So all of the stratagem of how people interact and play in music is in jazz. It's organized or it's open. It's slightly open, but it's kind of organized. All these different gradations of that. That's what I've always been after.
I think I love the tip about listening to solo records or duo records, because as you said it, I thought, yeah, that's what happened to me. And especially Chick Corea's second piano improvisation album, where he does something very proggy, and on the piano, it's that is it called Departure from Planet Earth or whatever that track is, where he goes, this is what this is about. It's a sound world I'm creating. It's not about the piano. And that was a key for me. That's a really interesting thing. The other thing that's cropped up in my mind is that I had a really unique experience playing with Robert Plant, because we were doing very big gigs. Obviously, we do 20 or 30,000 seater venues, but we would play tracks where the whole middle was just empty. We would just improvise. And so many times I'd be sat in a huge venue and where we dropped into Bitches Brew, because all the guys were jazz guys. They were all my friends in the band. And we dropped into Bitches Brew and we were playing Bitches Brew to 25,000 people. Absolutely bizarre, because Robert actually, Zeppelin comes out of this as well. All those bands came up at that thing. That's fusion. It's right across the board. That's another thing that's that I've thought, God, yeah, you're right, and maybe even my parameters of what fusion is limited. That it's a spirit, isn't it? That I came at the same thing. Narada talking to him. I said the spirit of music. There's a spirit that we're talking about, and it's an incredible thing.
Well, it goes back to Hendrix too, in the case of Page, and in the case of the guys that were Jeff Beck, exploding what the notion of a guitarist would be and what the vocabulary would be. And yes, they're coming out of the blues, but they're so looking forward. So yeah, I find that it's a spirit, as you say, and it's an attitude. And the attitude is know your stuff, and then what do you have to say about it? And ideally, you'll have something interesting to say, not just regurgitating what people have done before, but having a tip of a hat to that, and a nod, and know what you're coming from, and know where you're going. I like the idea of knowing what you're doing. That's a very simple concept. I teach it to my students. Know what you're doing. Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're trying to do? Do you have a mission somehow of what you're trying to accomplish here?
And that's often a reduction, isn't it? That's going, right, I've got this palette of things I do. And you could almost do this on an instrument that you don't play. You can still know what you're doing, but you can say, right, I don't play the piano, but I'm going to try and play a piece, and I'm going to just play long notes and space. And I think this is a part of music education that gets forgotten, because this is actually the way in for so many people. Because when you learn the instrument, you have to learn all the skills, but how do you learn how to play music? And you have to start somewhere. And the key is actually in free jazz, because they are dealing with those elements fundamentally exposed without the trappings of all the other stuff getting in the way so often. And I've never thought this before. This is why I love these conversations, because I want to learn myself, and I think that's something that's really come out of this conversation is the importance of this music and how it has to be preserved, and it is a repertoire, and we need to, make sure it happens. And you're doing that on your channel. So can you tell my viewers about your channel? Because anyone who's watching mine has to go over to Gregg's channel, because it's absolutely credible for prog fans, fusion fans, and all sorts of free music fans. So tell them a little bit about that.
Well, in August of 2020, I started a thing called the Progcast with Gregg Bendian. And it was really as a response to the shutdown of COVID and how musicians were now fragmented and not being able to play in the same space, but we could still talk. And I had done 10 years at Yale Oral History of American Music, where it was pretty limited in terms of what they thought was, well, certainly in an oral history situation, it's less of a discussion. It's more of a taking of information. And I did 150 of those for them with Sonny Rollins and Benny Golson and Pat Martino and Pat Metheny, and classical people like Gil Kalish and Ursula Oppens. The idea was that try to include as much of American music as possible. But that meant I couldn't do my lovely British friends that I was so inspired by. So I wanted this other outlet where I could just choose whomever I wanted to come talk to me. So that meant John Weathers from Gentle Giant, or Malcolm Mortimer, Steve Hackett and Tony Banks from Genesis, Andy Partridge from XTC, and actually almost everybody from XTC except for Colin. And then, be able to have Randy Brecker, Jean-Luc Ponty, Ralph Armstrong, Narada Michael Alden, Chester Thompson, Lenny White. So I could do the drummer thing. I could geek out on drums and the history of drumming. And so it's all of these things. I have all these different people, contemporary classical people, the opera director, Peter Sellers, anybody that I feel is doing something progressive to help things progress in the format, classical, rock, or jazz. I don't really care. If they're interesting, if they've done work that has been groundbreaking, they're probably going to end up on the Progcast. So we just hit our over 1,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. We started Patreon for that. So if people like that sort of thing, they could be a patron and support what we're doing. So I'm also doing younger bands now too. Bands that you may not have heard of have come on the Progcast, and if I hear a band, I'll invite them on if I like what they're doing, if I find it interesting, if I can hear connections. There's a group from Denver called Dandu that I heard opening for the great drummer Louis Cole in New York, and I talked to them, and they were interested in Weather Report, and they were interested in Jay Dilla, and they were interested in, again, fusing together a lot of different kinds of styles, but didn't know Egg, and didn't know Dave Stewart, and didn't know Soft Machine, but were interested. So I try to cover a lot of ground with the podcast, and it's not just people that I grew up worshiping, but it's also new people that I hear, and people that are still doing it after 50 years, still doing it after 40 years. People that are either the people that formed that music. I mean, Randy Brecker is one of the first jazz rock musicians, let's face it. So, anybody that's kind of innovated in some way that I've been aware of, I try to get them on the show. I mean, I'm a big fan, when you talk about metal, I'm a big fan of Meshuggah and Thomas Haka's drumming. And the new album is Immutable, is incredible to me, and it's compositionally super advanced, rhythmically beautiful in terms of note choices and rhythms. And so, I'm always interested in talking to those people who are trying to move things forward or slightly off to the side somewhere and say, well, this is how we're thinking about it. Meshuggah is a great example of, you would think that they're sort of a death metal kind of band, but they're super progressive in terms of the musical concepts. And that kind of drumming is just virtuosic. So I find all of those things really exciting. And I think the attitude is there too. In progressive metal, the attitude is still the same. Let's try something. Let's try to do something unique. Let's try to be ourselves and give you our take on what it is. So genre on the Progcast doesn't mean a heck of a lot. I'm more interested in concepts, you know.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic channel, and I think that conservatism that we discussed in the old days is being bust open by the internet now, because now that's been democratized. So, you know, when I was a kid, I'd have to go down the library and get the Penguin Book of Jazz out, and I was having to read that, and it would get to return forever, and there was, this album was poor and this wasn't great. And I go, what are they on about? I've got that album, it's amazing, you know. So I had to see through all that, but now I think that's all gone. And I think a musician like Louis Cole just represents, you know, it's pure fusion, and it's back, and it's my students are loving it, and they're coming to me and saying, we love this. Actually, it's my students that got me into Louis Cole a few years back. You know, they showed me the video and I was like, my God, this guy's incredible. And then I was able to show you, well, check out this. And so I feel as that there is, we've mentioned the word democratization so many times in this, you know. So, but yeah, anyone who's watching, go and check Gregg's channel out. The link will be in the thing below. And I think we've done an hour and 15 minutes, and I'm going to you know, I'm going to stop it there, Gregg. I hope we can have another chat, because I really enjoyed this. It's been really, I've just learned so much myself talking to you, and your career has been absolutely incredible. I just can't believe the stuff you've done. You know, there was so much. I wanted to talk to you about John Zorn. We'll save that to another time. All my heroes. You know, it's incredible stuff. So thank you for coming in, and I'm hopefully we'll do this again sometime.
Andy, my pleasure. And you've got a great channel as well, and you're doing a lot of interesting perspectives on value of the music that we both love. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of in the same boat here, trying to make things achieve a new sort of relevance. And also I would point people to my website, which is bendianmusic.com, where it's just a clearinghouse for all my historical work, for the podcast, videos of my stuff. And I teach also from Zoom on the Bendian Music site. So that's something where you'll get the whole picture. I try to have everything as in one place there. You'll find more about what I'm doing there. So thank you for having me, Andy. It's a pleasure.
That's brilliant. Now, I need to stop the recording, because when I interviewed Narada, after meeting my hero, I didn't know how to stop the recording, so I just edited the thing. So I might just disappear from view now, but I'm not sure what you press to.
No, pause recording.
Where does it say that? This is how professional I am.
You had the red button down there. That's where you press pause.
It says end. Shall I press that?
Oh no, that's not in the middle, Andy.
In the middle,
not on the side.
Well, I cannot see it at all. I've got chat, share screen.
Yeah,
this will all be on my channel, because I'm an absolute idiot. Oh no, I can't find it. I'm going to press more. I've got it. I'll stop the recording. Here we go. Thanks, Gregg. I've learned another thing from you, how to stop the Zoom. So the next time I do the next interview, I won't have this situation right then. Anyway, I'll say goodbye to everybody. Now, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, all that type of thing, and we'll see you on the next video.